have a distinguished panel discussion to complete this this first day of our conference. We called it Archives, Digital Technologies, Networking and Public Interaction. So everything you can expect when it comes to digitalization and sources, documents, and so on. And here on the podium, Eva Pfanzelter from Innsbruck and me are joined by Menyhért from Budapest, from the Budapest University of Jewish Studies. She's an expert in trauma studies, was also a fellow at the Wiesenthal Institute. Veerle Vanden Daelen from the Kazerne Dossin in Menyhért in Belgium. And Giora Zwilling from the infamous Arolsen archive. And Eva, I think, will introduce them in greater detail, and then they will give us a preview of what they are currently working on, I think, in a few minutes, and then we will see how we get into the discussion from there.
Yes, thank you, Dirk. Let me present to you this distinguished panelists that we have here. I start with Menyhért. As you heard, she is a professor of trauma studies at the Budapest University of Jewish Studies. Before that, she was a research fellow here in Vienna at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. From 2016 to 18, she was a Marie Curie research fellow at the University of Amsterdam, and previously she led the Trauma and Gender in Literature and Culture research group at the University of Budapest. Her research focus and interests, of course, include trauma studies, social media studies, memory studies, critical theory, and women's writing, and as I just discovered now here, also game studies, something forthcoming, which we are really looking forward to. Veerle Vanden Daelen, as you've heard, comes from Kazerne Dossin. She holds a PhD from the University of Antwerp. Her doctoral research focused on the return of Jews and the reconstruction of their life in Antwerp after the Second World War, basically from 1944 to 1960. She also held fellowships at the University of Michigan and the University of Pennsylvania, and she's the coordinator of the project Data Identification and Integration. No, that's a project, it's a work package for the EHRI project, so that's a very prestigious project, of course, that you're dealing with. And she's also affiliated with the University of Antwerp, where she's teaching something that's interesting me very much, migration history, Jewish history, and many other classes. Giora Zwilling, finally, Arolsen Archives, famous, infamous Arolsen Archives, as we've heard, studied history at the Open University of Israel and Tel Aviv University. Since 2018, he is deputy head of the Archives Department, and since 2017, the head of the Archive Description Office there. Before that, he was a media consultant for the United Nations Independent Commission of Inquiry on the 2014 Gaza conflict, and even before that, again, he was the head of the Arrangement and Digitization Department of the Yad Vashem archives in Israel. So a very distinguished panel, and I would kindly ask you now for a short introduction on one of your topics, on one of the things you're working on. Whoever wants to start? Ladies first, yes. Maybe? Yes.
I'll go ahead. So I'm situated in Mechelen. For those who do not know this, Kazerne Dossin holds both a memorial, a museum, and a research center on Holocaust and human rights. And I came there in 2016 with the EHRI project, which I had been working on since 2011. So I became the deputy, and I also am the director of collections and archives at this institution. So that means that we're coordinating what comes into the archive, how we share that with both the researchers and the public, how we communicate what we have in the archives with our educators and with the educational and public outreach department and communications, but also how we interact with academia and doing new research and new research topics, also in exploring digital tools and digital practices, as well as trying to connect what we have as much as possible with other archives. And that can be larger archives, that can be similar archives like our colleagues in the neighboring countries. It is through the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure. It's through also connecting with private archives and private individuals and everything, the whole wide range. And so I'm happy to discuss through this panel things on like how we share our data on our own website, how we share with the EHRI portal. We also have an interactive memorial page, how we engage with the public on that one. We have something similar that we did in Belgium on initiatives like Ich bin Sophie Scholl, but then the vlog van Vee about a young girl, together with public national television, where we did the educational modules from the museum, as well as the reading of the script. We did novel tools on Left Behind, a project on families left behind of men who were forced to work in northern France and were deported to Auschwitz from there. What happened to these families, where we tried to engage with maps and geo tools on how we work with this. And then, of course, we had the pandemic, as you all know, where we also had to explore 360 degrees virtual tours, virtual education, virtual visits, and so on and so forth. So that's just in a nutshell a couple of the things that I'm working on, but I don't want to take up too much time from the others, and we can engage in further detail later.
Okay, so it's me. I have because you said I could have PPT, so just a first slide. I have one slide which I would like to show, if you can. Maybe.
Is it on the laptop?
I sent it to you.
Is it on the laptop? Maybe?
I sent it to you in the email. Okay, no problem. No, because. Okay, so I just wanted to very shortly introduce my research, and I thought the best way would be to tell you my three hypotheses and to explain. So I moved to kind of literary and cultural trauma studies to digital trauma studies when I noticed how social media changes the nature of trauma processing, what happens in trauma-related communication on social media. And now I am moving to a next step, which is kind of transdisciplinary trauma studies and trauma policies, and how it is important to be aware of so it's not like I think that trauma, because there was this debate like kind of 10 years ago when whether trauma is a overarching principle and it explains everything, but it's not that. There is an element of trauma in many, many areas of culture and society, and we need to be aware of that. And one of these areas is Holocaust studies, and that's how I started out with Facebook groups on the Holocaust or about the Holocaust, and I started to study what happens in those groups and how the different kind of social media platforms define the communication about trauma, the representation of trauma, the processing of trauma, and also the transmission of trauma. As you know, that if you look at traumatic events, then you can have an impact, you can have a psychological from being uncomfortable to even symptoms of remote PTSD. It can happen. So this is what I look at, but it doesn't matter, I can explain. Yeah, okay, yes. So I have like three hypotheses very shortly. One of them is that social media has changed and will change further how we communicate about trauma, and it's basically and mainly because of how the element of silence which surrounds trauma can disappear on social media, because trauma is a break in a life story or a serious event, and many. Oh, okay, great. So just I just need the first one, okay, because the rest is. So yeah. So and then many times the victims of traumas they cannot talk about what happened to them. So that's the first level of silence. And then the second level of silence, that many times communities or societies, they cannot listen to the trauma. Like, for example, when the Holocaust survivors returned from the camps, people who were at home, they just couldn't listen to them. That was partly due to denial, but also because it's very difficult to listen to the trauma of the others. So that's kind of a second layer of trauma. And there's a third layer in communist regimes. There was a total tabooization of the Holocaust, for example. And that is what can change in social media groups. So people come together in those groups and they overcome decades of silence. And there are groups related to the Holocaust in several languages. I follow, I think, 10 in Hungarian and in English mainly, and I look at what happens in those groups. So my method is like very hands-on. I just go like a social media user and I look at what's happening, like as if I was reading a book. And a second hypothesis is that the indifference, the denial that causes secondary traumatization will not be so noticeable on social media, because either people just don't go there, don't comment, or if you get these kind of attacks or trolls or hate speech, that's a direct attack and it's easier to deal with than indifference and the wall of denial when people just don't pay attention. And then the third issue is the digital bystanders. They say many times we are all digital bystanders because we go on social media pages and we look at someone's cat and the next page is someone's total disaster or a war and we just don't do anything. We are just there. But there is also cyberbullying and all kinds of things when people get into a bystander role and they don't know what to do. And what I think is that historical trauma and intergenerational trauma is not only in the victim group but also in the bystander group. Bystanders are by far the largest group who experienced World War II, and they were alongside the victims, and some of them knew what happens, the others didn't know, and this is a huge group and we don't know too much about this group because there are no documents, there are no testimonies, there are a few now video testimonies. And what I want to know now, how the two different types of bystanders from two different eras, the digital age and the pre-digital age, can make us understand what happens when there are victims and why bystanders don't help, so that we can prevent this happening the next time. So this is my research. Thank you. I hope it wasn't too much too quick in, yeah.
Exactly. So I will maybe start with both the hosts said something about us being a little bit infamous, and that's actually a very good place to start. Exactly. I'm Giora Zwilling, and as was said, I'm head of the cataloging department and in some capacity the deputy head of the archives. I will talk a little bit about what we are doing and what I have the big, not fortune, how do you say? Proud to be involved in, but the best place to start in the infamous history of the ITS. The ITS was never conceived as an archive, but as a tracing service, which received a lot of original documents and later on copies on individual persecutees of the Nazi regime, all persecutees, not only Jews, forced labor, political prisoners, and so on. And for a long time was a tracing service under the charge of the ICRC, mainly. There was a very convoluted history, but it was very bureaucratic and very, very closed, which means a lot of people who are a bit older know that it was very hard to to get access to documents from the Arolsen archives, and survivors had to wait sometimes 3, 4, 5 years for very meager answers concerning their fate, or documentation concerning their fate in the war, or what happened to their relatives. That all began to change when the ICRC relinquished its mandate, but it was like a transformation process. The Arolsen archives, I will talk a little bit about it tomorrow when I introduce Every Name Counts, our initiative, is now run by an international committee, which is a political body, and has the clear mandate to change and to make everything available. That began in small scale over the years, but I think there were a lot of trials and errors in what it means to be an archive. And in the last 5 years, we actually achieved what I think was the purpose of the opening of the archive, and that's really radical openness. It began with the publishing of smaller collections, which are archivally sound and not very complex, but I think with the publication of now almost the complete historical documentation, except for that what is ethically and legally not possible, copies from other archives and patient file from the afterwar period. We almost published the complete historical collections, which is more than 35 million documents and 40 million names, not single names, reoccurrences, and it's growing every day because we're indexing. So I think in the transformation from a very rigid bureaucracy to a very open and very inclusive, how do you say that, institutions, that is like the first phase. The things that we are now which drive me to go forward are two trends. One is, first of all, continuing this trend of openness and adding documents from us, but also from other institutions. That's Connected Histories, that finding other institutions which are willing to share either scans, collections, but also only metadata, linked to them with this understanding that synergy is good, that we can create traffic and more awareness for other archives, smaller archives, bigger archives. I think everybody should interlink. And the second big thing is, which I will talk about more tomorrow, but happily also now, is making our documents more available by making them searchable. And with this, we also try to involve a commemoration aspect, like to give the public the opportunity to work on the documents themselves and to integrate the result of that work in the archive itself after QA. So that's from my side.
Thank you very much. And I must say, I've been on Every Name Counts. I've tried to crowdsource myself, and it's very fascinating. But we also have some pictures you can show, Veerle, or some images you want to show us, share with us before we go into the discussion.
Okay. Yeah, so I have a couple of the websites of the projects that we have at Kazerne Dossin listed here. So what you see here is our Beeldbank, which is a combination of collection descriptions with then the items in it. The public can see the collection descriptions in the reading room, and in our partner reading rooms you can see the images that are connected to it. And that is one of the things that comes with when we are talking about connected histories. They're not necessarily all public yet. I mean, this connectivity that Giora is referring to, in very many ways, archivists are also gatekeepers and are in very many ways also somewhat the missing voice in the whole discussion that we've had maybe throughout the day, because they have a lot of expertise and they can guarantee a lot of the right data, metadata, context, but also the serenity around the data and the privacy of some of the testimonies, because not every witness, be it a victim, be it a perpetrator, be it a bystander, is ready to be known with his full name. So that's one thing. But I could check in the meeting room, how many people knew Kazerne Dossin by name before I came here. right? So the next slide is where we share our data in the EHRI portal, and we also share with other archives, because you need to not only, it's not because you're digital that you're visible. You need to kind of go via different routes, and different routes lead to different contexts and reach different audiences. And for this, cooperation, synergies, like you mentioned, Giora, are so extremely important. And it might seem like a duplication, but it really isn't. It's really like making more coverage for us. So, and then the next one is like how we also make the link, because I said we're a research center, but we started out as a memorial. And so all the data that we find on the victims, you see already that's in our museum with the photos of those of whom we have been able to find a photo, and a silhouette of those whom we're still searching a photo for. When we started, when I started at the museum, we had 3 out of 5 victims. Now we have more than 4 out of 5 victims a photo. But people can commemorate online, whether there's a photo or not. They can light a candle, they can leave a message. So we have to bridge between academia, archivists, researchers, victims, the close victim community and the ones directly involved towards the broader society. Because if we believe in never again, we have to get everybody in the bath with us, and everybody has to know about what happened, and everybody has to feel concerned, right? So that's that. And then the next one is the Vlog van Fee. So Getnet is like public kids television in Belgium. They have like the kids journal, the news, and so the I think we also have to partner up. We need to find those bridging figures, and everybody has their own specialty. I cannot make a children's program. I'm a historian, but I can read the script that they propose, and I can say, no, this is not possible. This, okay, fair enough. You can have a bit of liberty, but also what we found was very important was that it goes from public television and kids television to the next slide. The next slide up is the learning modules, in which we also went with the camera into our archives, and in which our archivist is explaining to the children the documents on which we based this history. And even though kids these days have terrible handwriting and do not even know how to read handwritten cards and all of this, they all went to come and visit the memorial over the summer because they wanted to see the letter that Fee had received from her father, the last news she had received from him. So in that sense, it's something where we can also, from the digital, bring people back to the analog and bring them back to the sources and bring them back to the authenticity of the sources, which is absolutely great if you ask me. So that I wanted to show as well. For Left Behind, the next website up, we are both publishing in academia as well as having a project to a wider audience. And actually the one to the wider audience, and he's not here now, but Wolfgang is going to be back tomorrow. He helped us with all the maps, and with the maps we kind of created interactive ways to interact with the public. And guess what? It leads us to also new understanding on an academic level of what we are seeing here and what we're doing here. And I think if there's one of the most fascinating things in anything digital, it's all the applications that we can do with geo-tagging, geo-names, time referencing, and all of these things, and connecting things to that. Documents, videos, analysis. So that's really fascinating. And so I'm not sure how many websites. That is, for example, then more in the academic realm. I showed our collections in EHRI, but EHRI also has a document blog, and there you can also explore new methods more academically. And that's also fascinating because it's like going out of the A1, A2, whatever type of publications with the very rigid system in academia to kind of go in this new area and see what we can do and see how far we can also bring academic analysis in there but also our transport lists are a blog post there that explain on the document interactively what is what on a transport page. So it's really fascinating to kind of use the digital to also help people in your reading room when they see the documents and kind of making it go full circle. And and we also very much invest in short movies and also into multilinguality, because we're in Flanders, we speak Dutch, or Flemish if you like. We also have French and German in our country, but we also think we should do a lot in English, and this is, for example, one of those short movies. I won't put it on because I've seen that it's going a bit too slow, but you're welcome to try it out and get back to me if you would have any questions about it. And then the last thing is also, we had an exhibition that was born in the pandemic, #FakeImages, on anti-Semitism and the mechanisms of stereotypes, where ideally you would say in a pandemic you make everything available straightforward online, but don't do that with anti-Semitic images, because you don't want them to spread out of context, and you know that's very problematic, and you really have to kind of... So there we had the tour, but we only made it visitable in a workshop setting in a closed environment. So digital does not always mean public, and public can have different layers, and I think that's a fascinating thing about the digital possibilities that we have right now to share our message and go digital, but also bring people back analog, and that sense. So that was a bit more illustrated what I just said in the earlier introduction.
So maybe I can just start from here, if it's okay with you, Dirk, with the first round of questions. Because I think we have some answers already now. You showed us some very impressive things that you're doing, but my question still remains, how can we cross the bubbles or go beyond the bubbles, beyond our bubbles, to reach a wider audience? How can we actually use both technology but also academia? Like you've shown us here very nicely. I mean, how do we all deal with these great, fascinating databases that we have, and all the material is in there? How could we really use that to contribute something in the discourses on social media? I mean, this is true for all three of you. Maybe that's the first round of questions that I can ask.
Yeah. Well, if I may, from the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure and from what we've all lived through with the pandemic, even doing things digital requires very often an analog discussion and an understanding of what you can do and how you could do it. So I think we've all been very courageous and trying to go as far as possible in digital only and all being at home, but I think that's one of the things where that creative process of what you bring into the digital world still it's a bit of a paradox of the digital world that you all. I mean, that's one of the things that I took with it.
Okay, so we had this. We had this question in an email. The moderator sent the two questions to us, and this is the second one: how to connect, basically, how to go outside of. And I was thinking what to say, and I teach at the University of Jewish Studies, and there are of course young students who come, many of them from the Jewish schools in Budapest, and many of them are from Roma communities. It's a new corporation, and they have in the Jewish schools this kind of Holocaust education, so they have a lot of knowledge. They are already a bit overwhelmed when they come to the university. Then we have the MA students. I had a group for a course now, Trauma and Cultural Memory, with 8 students. These MA students in Jewish cultural history, they are all older. It's always an identity issue when they come to do this MA. Many of them they have professions like lawyers, mental health professionals, some even local politician. And then when they have established their lives, and they suddenly have this idea to study more the identity questions, and they get overwhelmed too. So I won't recall now the whole discussion, but what I told them is that I would like to tell you now here, and also relating to what Marianna asked, where are the painful issues? So it's nice and fascinating how much we can do in the archives and on the internet, but these are really painful stories. And it's not only the task of the victim community intergenerationally to take on the education, to take on the task of educating others. It's already a burden to be in the victim community. And when others don't know so much about it, then suddenly they have this urge to study more and to involve others, and then others don't want to be involved so much. So it's always a paradox situation how it's not only with Jewish history, but also Black Lives Matter, any minority group, they always somehow get into the position that they they have the burden of educating others, because others don't take the effort, don't take the time to learn. And that's what I told these students when they got overwhelmed, that it's not only your task. We have to find a way to involve others. So that I think this is what I can say here too. So to use social media to involve others. People have an interest, but it's a painful knowledge, and people have to be able to bear that painful knowledge which comes with these stories. Yeah.
As an archivist, I might be like the wrong person, because normally I say, well, if I publish it, who wants, he will use it. But I think over the last, no, but yeah. It's for that we have a PR department and a Bildungsabteilung. But I think what we've learned in the last 2 or 3 years, or what I've learned, is that I was very skeptical if people who are not interested in a matter will somehow get involved, but was actually quite surprised. And I think when I look at what the Arolsen archives did, it's like having a lot of different Angebote, like offers from like social media and for researchers, and an e-guide that explains our documents, and a lot of publications and events, so that people who are somehow interested will come and look for materials concerning them. It's much easier when we have like a name-based archives, but I was surprised that the best method was actually giving work to the public. With our indexing project, I think that was really the first time that we had people getting really involved who have nothing to do with our field of studies or a family history. When we look at the comments in the Every Name Counts forum, where we uploaded documents and asked people on an open platform, which is not Holocaust related. It's Zooniverse. It's an amazing thing where you can do a lot of science projects mainly. And we asked people to help us index data. And then we had a lot of users who really from Spain or from Chile or from the US, and students who really have nothing to do with the theme, who really were very enthusiastic through this engagement and like the sense of being able to do something which is worthwhile. That worked extremely well in the pandemic, one has to say. It's now a little less strong, but that was a really interesting thing to observe, that participating and helping is something that seems to break like those barriers.
Mm-hmm. Are there first questions in the audience? I mean, we have an interesting tension here on the panel, right? I mean, and it was fascinating what you said about what you are doing in the virtual space, and there are also these opportunities and new things you can do. Also affects, of course, the broader audiences, but also research in the end. And I mean, especially for Arolsen, I mean, this is why I said infamous, because when I started in that Holocaust business, I I knew, oh, there's this place Arolsen, but nobody had seen it actually, and nobody could go there. And only in the last 10 years, right, it really, became popular, so to say, and that's very much connected, as you showed us, with digitization, right? This is why it is so well known now. But then there is this other aspect, right, of the virtual space and social media and so on, which is, there's also something to do with re-traumatization, and images are circulating that, you never know if these people want these images to have been circulated, right? So this brings up all these interesting questions where also the limits of, we can do a lot, but where are the ethical limits of what you also do in the archives, especially in archives that, like Arolsen, are mainly related to specific people, right? Individuals. This is the order of the archive, right? It's not a thematic archive. It's an archive on individuals. And maybe we can explore that a little bit more. But if there is a first question, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi. So thank you all for your wonderful introductions. It's very thought-provoking. And what I'm thinking about in relation to all of your projects is the change or impact of digital culture and digital media on traditional subject positions in terms of each one of any project. So I'm thinking about the role of the Holocaust scholar or researcher. Do we become curators? Is there a shift? Also in terms of the archivist, if engagement becomes a thing and also subjects become part of the archiving process or indexing process, how does this change the subject positions? And also to Anna, your work is very thought-provoking, especially the concept of the digital bystanders. And I'm thinking to myself in terms of the traumatized person / victim, what does digital media offers to the process of processing trauma, also transmitting trauma, and does it affect the conventional, traditional subject positions when it comes to trauma? We know all of this literature about testimonies in the digital age and what happens to trauma, but then I wonder now in contemporary events what happens to the traumatized, and do digital media offer new affordances to process and deal with trauma?
Do you want to answer that directly? Why not?
Okay. So I have been studying this for years, what happens on digital media with trauma, and there are different, one of the conclusions is that the platform defines what happens on trauma. So in Facebook groups, for example, it's usually support. So what people get, they get support in Facebook groups. They got support also in the Me Too campaign on Twitter. But for example, when on YouTube someone watches videos, it's kind of out of control. Then it's more like transmission of trauma. Or when people watch disasters, and then this can be also overwhelming. So people don't know their limits. But for example, with Mikola, there we started to study now the responses on the war in Ukraine. The first responses, how the refugees arrived to Hungary and Poland, and how social media again offered support. And there were some videos when it was clear that the support that these people got through social media, because they made the links and they learned how and where to go, that was very helpful. So it might prevent the further traumatization. So what I have been thinking for some time, just didn't get the opportunity or the funding to do, for example, a video game which helps traumatization, or to do some experiments how we can use digital media as a tool specifically for this purpose. Yeah, that's.
But there was also the question how the work of the historian changes, right? And
the archivist, and also I think that we can also think about it in terms of like pupils or visitors. Like if you see a change in subject position.
It's a good question. Would you like, or should I?
You can go first.
I mean, the Arolsen archives are somewhat unique in that think that we have a clear mandate to supply data, information concerning individuals. So we are the archive of a tracing service, and that's why when we catalog and when we index, our first focus is actually not the historian, it's the family, and that is something which is quite interesting. We try to find the, how do you say that? My English. Izun. To find like a balance, exactly, between the needs of both communities, but because of the history of the archive, and after its opening, there was like a huge shift toward research and very, very accurate, very German archival practices, which left out of focus the actual function of the archive. We pushed the balance again a little bit towards family, but we tried to find the balance between both and make the archive both accessible on theme and provenance, and also enable very complex big data queries for future digital humanists, as well as not to forget the right of people to get to the documents concerning their family. But I think sometimes the historians might come short when you look at the big picture at the time being.
Based on what I've seen mostly in the European Holocaust research infrastructure, what the digital possibilities offer us now are things that 30 years ago archivists could only dream of, to have all this interconnectivity. What it brings to us is very much the end of the, if it already existed, idea that an archivist is an objective describer of the sources, because all of the finding aids, when you bring them all together in one platform, what do you see? They're all different, and they all tell you about the history and the context in which finding aids have been written, which is really an interesting thing for historians then again to learn, because they think of archivists to provide them with a objective description of what is in the sources, the opening for them to the sources. So I find that fascinating. It gives a lot of community feeling and a lot of possibilities for exchange that was not possible. So I think it's really fascinating, but it also makes it sometimes very tricky for archivists to kind of see where to focus on and how to do it and how to start, especially when it's then combined with some legislation called GDPR and so on and so forth. But then it also does affect the profession of the historians, the Holocaust historians, in the sense that I think academia is slowly but certainly opening up more towards a wider audience and not only appreciating the strictly academic publications. Having said that, that doesn't mean that you can still be a strictly academically publishing academician who does not engage in blog posts and who's not going to have a Twitter account and so on and so forth. That's all still very possible. And there I think it depends on who you are and where you feel comfortable with, whether you feel most comfortable in the setting that it used to be, or whether you're actually excited about bridging or whether you rather talk to this person who can bridge for you or help you bridge. Because I think it was referred to in one of the discussions earlier today as well, the interdisciplinarity is one of the things that came much more to the fore because of the digital, because I mean, I still have to find the person who can deal, first of all, with all the Holocaust sources to begin with, because only language-wise that's mission impossible. But then also, disciplinary-wise, it's mission impossible. If you want to reach all the audiences that we want to reach today in the most efficient way, there's not a single person who can do it. So I think you just create a lot more diversity and variety in the field of Holocaust studies and Holocaust research.
And then we have a set of questions.
I think
We
there
have
was
not-
a question,
yeah.
right?
Not talked about archiving social media yet. I think, yeah, we have to start with you.
I was just referring to also because I had a similar thought as Vital, and because I think not only the staff or the historians, researchers, archivists' role is changing, but in general there is a shift in the balance between the institutions and their audiences. In your examples, in Dossin and in Arolsen, you can see that I would say something that we all on the historical sites are trying to achieve is getting more on an eye level with our audience and taking the expertise of our visitors, users seriously and asking them to engage with the content and thus also acknowledging everything that they can and offer.
By the way, just a comment, it's not easy because, I mean, we always talk about like the successes and how amazing this is. One thing we've learned at the Arolsen Archives is when you give the public avenue to talk with you, they use it as they want to, and we don't have like Nazis or something. On the contrary, we have a lot of people who use our, for example, the possibility to leave a comment in the online archive in order to upload tons of information. Now, we never envisioned that, and the information is amazing. The problem is, how do we archive it? How do we QA it? What do we do when something changes with the platform? So there are a lot of, I mean, we do respect the users, but we still have a long way to go. I mean, some of it is a learning process. Just a word of caution if you add like a comment function. Be wary of that. Sorry.
There is another question. Yeah.
I wanted to come back to Ava's bubble thing, which I think Iris should claim some money for every time we say the word bubble. Yeah. But there's been this kind of shift, like some of the people in academia that were writing about digital Holocaust stuff started off in general being very critical. It often came from literature studies, Jewish studies, trauma studies, history studies, and yeah, you would see people, what really was at the kind of crux of their arguments was they didn't really like digital. They were a bit suspicious of the digital things, the digitality of the project. And there seemed to be a kind of, there seemed to be a kind of automatic criticism of Holocaust institutions and where they archive museums and memorial sites. But one of the things I've kind of noticed more recently is the side of it seems to be difficult to break is actually the creative industries. And it was really interesting talking about the children's broadcast, the blog project. Because from my experience, institutions are much more interested in thinking critically about this, wanting to reach out. But there's tensions within these creative industries in kind of getting them to take seriously a conversation between the archives and historians and academic, and mix the two. I've seen this from kind of games industry, but also social media influencers. What they want to seem to do is, we'll do your Holocaust work for you, but on our own terms. And I don't know if you have experience with the broadcasters or any other projects where that seems to be what I'm starting to notice the more I'm kind of talking to those industries. That's the area that's really hard to infiltrate, and it seems that they're the ones that get them potentially the bigger reach, right? And that's where a lot of these stereotypes and tropes come from as well. Schindler's List, etc.
I think that's always something that can happen, and that obviously does happen. One thing that there is also in this digital world is that you can kind of make your own institution or your own academic affiliation or your archive or your research background a kind of quality label as well. So for us it was like when we associate our name with a project, that means that we will have had enough to say, to feel comfortable, to say we can ensure that this is according to the standards that we set forward. And if that is not happening, well then our name will not be on it. So in that sense, that's, I think, one of these things with many of these projects is, as trivial as it may sound, but your own institution logo may well be your data seal of approval to kind of be a quality label that you kind of put out there in the digital world as well. And that comes then with media literacy to those who are using and working with what is out there, because some of us here in the audience know much better than I do what's all out there on the internet, and it's not like when we used to go to an academic library where you could go and everything was acquired by the librarian and it was like sort of curated for you what you get to see in the library. You can't do that with the internet, so we cannot start cleaning up the internet, and we cannot but we can put those flags out to indicate what is from whom, and consider ourselves working to the standards that we set forward as we have learned them in academia and through our ethical mission as well into the world. So
I can strengthen that and say that we also had, I mean, it's less my department as the archive, we are more like the basis, but our PR and other departments started like cooperations with creative agencies and so on. And it's not always easy, and it's like a mutual process of finding like a common ground. And there was a lot of talk about loss of control, and I think within the institution, which is very big, and some of it is more conservative, and some of it is less conservative, and is more willing to have like inaccuracies. It was a process of learning to live with the fact that not everything will be like 100% sure. Not every comment in social media is checked by 3 historians and weighed out. It's something, if you want to be out there, I think it's something you have to live with. A little bit.
Please go ahead. I have one more comment here.
Okay, so I have a comment more than a question to Anna. As a fellow trauma studies scholar, I have this kind of doubt about your idea of visibility of trauma on the internet. I mean, okay, it's true, but there is also kind of another thing going on. Internet can be a cruel place, and there are people who are kind of shamed into disappearance. So they post something, they get bullied, they get negative comments. So either they delete the post, or they kind of disappear from the internet completely, or they are somehow protected by institutions. So for example, roughly 10 years ago, there was, I think, a 12-year-old girl who went for a school trip to Majdanek. And she got photographed in one of the ovens. So when you go to Majdanek now, the entrance to the ovens is blocked with, there is like a piece of glass in front of the oven, so you cannot kind of walk into or whatever. And that was done specifically to prevent this thing from happening in the future. And I talked to people from the museum and they confirmed that. But since that was 10 years ago, she was kind of protected from the consequences of what she's done, and the photograph disappeared from the internet. But we might imagine a situation in which someone has really kind of severe psychological consequences of the thing that they did online because they didn't know how to do things online. They posted something that got criticized, and we again are in this kind of field of invisibility of trauma that was caused online, either by this kind of digital bystander thing or by other people on the internet.
Yeah, it can happen. I think there also, I said, cyberbullying is an issue or a thing. But there, for example, courses for bystander, what is it called? So how not to be a bystander, and it's also for both for real life situations and both for digital situation. And it teaches people. For example, I went to such a training. It's actually for Asian Americans because many Asian Americans experienced an increase in harassment during the COVID pandemic, because that was like the Chinese virus, and it was like not only people shouted at them, but actual physical violence. And there's this Asian American institution, and they have this campaign for not to be a bystander. And then they teach people, and the training I went to, it was like for 500 participants, and it was a very quick thing, like 1.5 hours, and you learn how not to be a bystander. And it's also about digital situations. So what to do when you see that you don't go and comment on under the same post, but you look up the person in a private message, or there are ways to save people from disappearing from such situations, if many people know how not to be a bystander, which did not happen in the historical situations because people did not know how not to be a bystander. They were bystanders. And this is kind of an awareness which comes from a knowledge about trauma and how trauma was made possible, historical trauma, Holocaust trauma in Germany. There are many studies on what society, how it happened, what happened in the society, what kind of bystander behavior made it possible that nobody opposed really what happened through a decade. It changed the whole attitude of a society. So I think this is on the internet. There are already some ways to prevent such cases. Yeah.
But sometimes I just read that kind of offering helpful comments to people who are being attacked online is sometimes counterproductive.
Yes.
Because it makes the post more visible.
Yes.
So you are thinking that you are kind of helping the person, but in fact you are making it
But
worse.
it's the same in real life situation, according to this training, because then the attacker gets more angry. So then you need to be like go sideways, and maybe they even said that in some areas in New York you don't call the police because it even makes it worse. So there are the ways how to, because firefighters and policemen. So what's the name for this? The people who react, first responders. Yes, they are trained to do this, how to do it. And the majority of the people are not trained how not to be a bystander. And I've been reading a lot about social psychology, and it takes a kind of attitude when you are willing to get into a situation and sort of make the situation disappear by simply being there or saying one thing or just looking at the victim can help afterwards, because they can feel that they are not alone. So these gestures work also in the digital world.
Yes, I have more question that goes back to archives and documents, because we have talked a lot about the younger generation and media literacy, and also there's two ways of learning from the users. And so I would just be interested if you have any experience on how this media literature within the younger generation also makes you reflect on documents, because documents are media, and like if there are discoveries by users in documents that you would not have thought about, like things that could be read out of documents that are not expected. Are there any experiences from archives or even the EHRI document blog where people can comment? Yeah.
Should I start? I think with Every Name Counts, it's the first time, when we published the archive, there were some comments, but it wasn't like a flood, because it's normally more people search for something. And with Every Name Counts, it was quite interesting, because there we uploaded like 1 million Buchenwald cards and set parameters, what we want the people to index, name, birth dates, and so on. And we were quite surprised that people started hashtagging the documents, and it wasn't something in the beginning that we told them. So it's not specific for younger users, but people were aware of a lot of things. They started hashtagging when it's a teenager, when it's a child, when it was some kind of a sub-commando of a camp where the Germans had or the Nazis had operation names like Meerschaum or Nacht und Nebel for certain kinds of things. So we were quite amazed at, and famous people, musicians. So it was quite interesting to see that people have a complete different view than archivists. Sometimes they held up things that we just didn't think, okay, it's too much, we can't go into this level of detail. But sometimes it was a completely thematic approach. We haven't evaluated this yet. When we build our workflows now, we don't do please note if it's a musician, but it's nice to see that people, it comes from below, and it's quite interesting to see. It's not a very satisfactory answer, but
Yeah, if there's one thing that we also learned via EHRI, for example, was also how the digital world sometimes lacks information. Like, for example, a lot of the scans, microfilms used to be in black and white, and let the color of your pen in the German Nazi administration have had a meaning, gave an indication on your rank. And so therefore, we really needed the colored scans or the analog documents. So that is one.
I have to say that the Belgian State Archive demands black and white scans. We just scanned the new collections, and they didn't allow us. They wanted black and white copies.
I know.
It's quite depressing.
Sorry. I do not identify as the State Archive.
I know.
But yeah, the other thing is also that while explaining documents to people, like for example with the Transportliste, that it brings you again more to what is actually written there. The abbreviations on the Transportliste, like AB, like for Arbeitseinsatzbefehl, fair enough, that I knew and that I very much had in mind. But then the KA, the keine Einladung, and that you're not invited. Meaning you were arrested during a roundup or something like that. That's by explaining that, it kind of brings you back to, wow, yeah, you have to go and explain that. And also things that possibly people who have been living with the sources for decades haven't looked at. I think it doesn't necessarily come with the age. It can also just be by bridging your bubble, by coming out of your bubble. For example, a lost card that is thrown out of a train by a father to his family. He will not survive. But the only thing the family ever looked at was the text that the person wrote to his family, to his son, to his wife. They never really gave any attention to the name of the woman who put her name and her home address on there and put the stamp on there and mailed it. And these type of every fresh look at archives can provoke new questions and new things, and the younger generation also kind of makes us obliges us to explain also what media were like back then, if we are already in a position to fully describe that, as we were not there ourselves either. So in that sense, I think it's fascinating how the dialogue and the exchange can lead to things becoming all of a sudden coming to the fore that otherwise remained unquestioned.
I don't know, after all, EHRI-AT is an institutional network, so I was wondering, as a very last topic maybe, because I overheard your conversation outside. It's interesting because, I mean, and we talked about balances and speaking on eye level to the audiences, but there we could also talk about speaking on eye level between these institutions, and there are obviously huge institutions, right, that dominate that field. I mean, USHMM, Yad Vashem, Arolsen might be one of those huge institutions, right, with millions and millions of documents. And I mean, USHMM and Yad Vashem collected documents from all over the world before it was digitized, right, just by photocopying or scanning or microfilming. And the idea was obviously, I guess, you only need to go to Yad Vashem, and then you don't need to travel anywhere else for your research, right? Not to Eastern Europe, and the same in DC and so on, right? Makes it easier for historians and researchers. You talked earlier outside about your vision connecting all these archives, right? So I think your institution is smaller, right? One of the smaller, and you said small is beautiful. This is too big to fail, small is beautiful. So what about these institutional also, I mean, there's also a competition maybe between these institutions, and so what does it do with these institutions in a network like that, right? I mean, in the end, it's easy to imagine. I mean, historians don't need to travel anymore. Either you only go to Arolsen because they have the bulk of the information, or you even stay at home and do it from there. So what does these also do with these smaller institutions, maybe? Because I guess it affects them more.
I'm not too sure, because I think the local context and the kind of seeing eye to eye, that's easier done locally than going to somewhere far, far away for a very short time. So being there locally and having your role in society and your role towards local researchers is definitely out there and very, very, very important. And yes, this interconnectivity is very, very, very important. Recontextualizing sources. In EHRI, we've been working on copy and original linking, because also for the copying archives, also the larger aggregators benefit from getting this information of smaller archives or local archives, because it brings in metadata written by people with different sets of expertise, with different language skills, with different cultural backgrounds, local settings, missions of this institution, and so on and so forth. And that's the beauty of it. Like, there's no two finding aids that look the same. And if beforehand, before the digital, you could have like a card box file that was sort of considered finished, or you would have a stenciled finding aid that was finished and in the reading room as a finding aid to this archive, I have to meet the first person to tell me that their database is fully finished. So everybody is all the time updating, going to a new environment, making new connections. So that makes it very complicated. And also, so I don't like to think in terms of competition, but I think it's more of something where if you're really investing time and effort into building certain things, that you're not all the time in the position to be able to react on or have the competencies in your institution, especially when you're smaller, to be able to connect and interconnect that easily. So I think we should keep on exploring because there are also very big institutions where the knowledge of smaller institutions can come in very, very helpful. A national archive is such an example. A national archive, by definition, holds a ton of material. They cannot possibly have experts on every topic they cover, or every language that comes into their national archives, or even a regional archive. And then all this interconnectivity can be such a helpful tool, both for people who are dealing with the sources, preserving them, opening them up, the researchers the victim communities, the perpetrator descendants, but the whole wider society benefits from all this interconnectivity. Is it easy? No. Is it a mess? Yeah, definitely. But it is creating new things, and it is extremely exciting to see what we can learn there and how much it is. I mean, it's a bit daunting at times, but it is extremely exciting.
So the final word? No, your vision. At the end, your vision.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to say that as a mid-sized player, with a background in Yad Vashem, I see the Arolsen archives as well as the USHMM and Yad Vashem, who are like bigger players, have a dual function, which is, well, our original collections are our original collection, and there we have the duty to do everything. But we also are collecting institutions, which add copies from other ones, but there we are like the highway, and the views from the highway are not the nicest ones, but it brings you somewhere, and then you take a nice scenic road, which is the small archive. I mean, I think a lot of the times we are like a way to know that there is a Kazerne Dossin, and that the Jewish community in Leipzig has an amazing small collection, and that there is in Majdanek a small collection, because not everybody knows that. No? So that's a little bit my view of like the bigger infrastructure, and maybe at some point we will have like a main train line, which is EHRI or a different thing which connects us all.
But before you leave the stage, unfortunately, I have to introduce one more topic. Actually, it has been already talked about a little bit here and there. I don't know, you probably all know the story about Read On, My Dear, the very famous blog, and Marie-Sophie Hingst, who wrote that blog. And she died after being scammed online because she was basically found out that her blog about her Jewish parents, apparently Jewish parents, was fake. So anyway, she died after that. And now we have these pages, and here we come more into my area of expertise, so to say. Her blog disappeared. She deleted it, but it's of course, on the Internet Archive. And here comes my question to all of you, basically. So how do we deal with the Internet as an archive for historians? And that's also the question that ties into Lita's comment from before. How does our profession change, like Dirk's and mine, or yours as archivists? So we have this one story here that I can just read the rest of on the Internet Archive, somebody who has apparently not found help, both online or offline. And we have these different archival institutions here that are trying to do archival work. How do you do your backup? How do you deal with the Internet Archive? What data is being given there, and so on?
We. I think it's difficult. I mean, I just read the Surveillance Capitalism, so I'm a bit less optimistic than I was. I mean, at the time being, I can start with the positive. I mean, we published millions of documents. They are online for 5-6 years now. We have 1.5 million unique users, and we had until now approximately 20 requests to block data, which we blocked. In the internet, blocking is a thing. I mean, it's probably if somebody saved it or if somebody is savvy, he can find it. But we still hadn't had a big problem. I mean, something like radical. And we do block some of the things ourselves because of ethical reasons, such as patient files and child tracing files are not available online. But what the implications are for the long run, I mean, there we still have to see. And sometimes you get a little bit queasy because I think people have the right for their own information, but it can also be misused. I'm actually here very interested in what others have to say. It's very open.
I don't know. Well, how do you see that, Anna? How would you deal with something that she obviously deleted and now it's still there? She wanted it deleted and then she probably took her life, but now it's there.
It's not, for me, it's not so different from the pre-digital, so it happened before that you find it, someone else finds it later, they find it, it's in the attic, it's somewhere, people were hiding it, and so I don't see so much the digital aspect. It's maybe yes, because when you find it, more people get to know about it, but that's just speed, yeah, like not a quality difference.
Yeah, I think I want to just add on to what has already been said, to not be repetitive, that there is also a role for archivists as gatekeepers to kind of protect privacy and private things, even though they do need to be documented. So the other way around, and not a fake thing, but the real thing. But we have interviewed people who have, during their interview, said things that they haven't told their own children. And they are very, very private, and they come with sexual harassment and so on and so forth, with guilt feelings on survival and actions that could have had an impact in the camp, or really sensitive things where we as archivists need to kind of, or as an archive, need to step up and kind of be a gatekeeper, so that when these sources need to be accessed, that they are accessed by people who know the context and who are prepared for what they will get to see, and who may not need to see the full identity of the person. The same for people who are too traumatized to ever be, identified or spoken to about the trauma. There as well, we can be gatekeepers. We have people who are very upset with us. They say, well, you have an interview with a person who was there, and I am doing research on this, and I need to speak to this person, where we have to say, that's all nice and well, we will transmit your request to this person, and if this person wants to react, then this person will react to you, but we cannot give you this person's information, because the testimony or what sources this person left to us are too important, but we still have to really be careful about what this person's, their privacy. What worries me a lot and what will get lost is not necessarily what has been public, because if it has been public, then it probably has been downloaded or it is somewhere still available. But I'm more worried about all these emails that, in which people also say a lot of very valuable things, but in a mixture of private and work context sometimes, and where it's very, very double whether that can actually be archived as a source or not, and all these type of vague zones that we have, like photos that we made but with unclear permissions, and all of that is, will keep us on providing us with a job for a long
Okay. Shall we call it a day? Yeah, I guess so. Right. So let us thank our distinguished panelists here.